Hi, this is Dr. Watson, and today we're going to talk about interest groups. Specifically, introductory sort of lecture is designed to give you kind of an overview of some of the big puzzles that interest groups raise in the context of political science. So first, it's important to note that interest groups and political parties are different. If we go back to the Federalist Papers, which I'm going to ask you to sort of dig back into your knowledge of history, when the founding fathers had gotten together and they created the US Constitution, and they were trying to pitch it to the various states to ratify the Constitution, to approve and adopt the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were written largely by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison as a way to sell the Constitution, to kind of promote this new form of government that they were recommending. And in the Federalist Papers, James Madison in particular spends a lot of time talking about the threat of factions. He's concerned about the role that small groups of like-minded people will play in a democratic system, and the fact that these small groups of like-minded people may derail the democratic process and promote policies that benefit their interests and not the interests of society as a whole. And he spends a great deal of time talking about how our system of government is designed to limit what he refers to as the mischief of factions, this sort of negative effect. When he talks about factions, what he's talking about are actually two things. He's talking about political parties, which came into existence almost immediately after the ratification of the Constitution, but he's also talking about interest groups, right? Interest groups tend to be more focused than political parties. So where a political party is going to stake out a position on just about every political issue you can imagine, an interest group is going to be focused on just a few political issues. Some are focused on just one political issue. So for example, you might have an interest group like the National Rifle Association that is focused entirely on the issue of guns and the right to bear arms. Or you may have an interest group like NARAL, the National Abortion Rights Action League, that is focused entirely on the issue of reproductive freedom. Some interest groups are broader than that. So for example, the American Civil Liberties Union is focused on a wide range of issues that impact civil liberties, so your right to free speech, and they are concerned with issues related to rights of criminal defendants, constitutional rights, a whole host of constitutional issues, religious freedom as well. But they're not interested in everything. So the ACLU, for example, doesn't really have a position on the environment much. They are a little bit concerned with the effects of pollution on different groups of people, but for the most part, they're not concerned with the environment, and they don't really have a position with respect to foreign policy, right? They're not that broad. The other way in which interest groups and political parties really differ is their role in elections. A political party actually puts forward its members as candidates in an election. Interest groups are often involved in elections. They endorse specific candidates. They run ads that influence the elections. They're involved in elections. They get their members to go out and vote, but they do not have their own candidates. There is no NRA candidate for president. There is a candidate for president that the NRA prefers, but he is not running on a ballot with the words National Rifle Association after his name. Okay, so that's the big difference between interest groups and parties. One of the reasons that interest groups are particularly interesting to political scientists is that in a way, they shouldn't exist. The reason for that is something called the collective action problem. So let's sort of step back and think about this for a second. Imagine that you are an interest group. It can't really be a group, but imagine that you are, pretend that you are. You're an interest group and your concern is creating reproductive freedom, right? So you are interested in liberalizing abortion laws. Okay, if you are successful, if you get what you want, everyone enjoys the fruits of your labor. Everyone has an opportunity to receive a legal abortion. I mean, within reason, right? So it doesn't matter whether somebody actually helped you or not. If you are successful, they get the benefit of your labor. So the collective action problem is this puzzle. Why do people join interest groups when they don't have to? If I join NARAL, right, I give money to NARAL, I give time to NARAL, I do these things for NARAL, right? I lose something. I lose my money, I lose my free time, etc. And maybe NARAL is then successful in its policy agenda and I get the outcome that I want. But I could have had that without doing the work, because NARAL, by definition, is trying to achieve a public policy outcome, something that everyone gets, whether they helped or not. In the alternative, if I support NARAL and NARAL is unsuccessful, now I don't have the policy that I want and I'm out money and time. That's a terrible outcome, right? So why should I ever join an interest group? Why should I ever participate in this collective action, when instead I can be what's called a free rider? I can be the person who holds on to my private resources, who holds on to my money and my time, and then enjoys the fruits of other people's labor when they are successful. That seems like a pretty good deal. And the problem is that if everyone has an incentive to be a free rider, then no one has an incentive to join a group and do the actual work, contribute the money and spend the time to achieve the outcome. So the way that interest groups kind of get around this free rider problem is twofold. First, in terms of forming, sort of creating a group, coming together to coalesce, right, to emerge as a group. We rely very heavily on people we call political entrepreneurs. An entrepreneur is like an independent business person. A political entrepreneur is someone who has a particular interest beyond the normal interest in a public policy. This could be because of their particular life experiences. So for example, the woman who created Mothers Against Drunk Driving was inspired to do that because her daughter was killed in a drunk driving accident. It mattered, the issue of drunk driving and laws to limit drunk driving mattered way more to her than they would to just sort of the typical person who wants safe roads, right? She had this really heightened interest. So some political entrepreneurs have these personal stories that make them interested in a policy in a way that it goes beyond what the rest of us want. It's something incredibly intensely personal and important to them. Some political entrepreneurs are not emotionally invested in a particular policy, but instead their participation in the political process is motivated from some other need that they have. So for example, perhaps you have a group that forms because a college student is trying to get into law school, right? And it looks good to have something like that on your resume. Or perhaps a group forms because John Smith looks around and says, there are a lot of people who are interested in gun rights, and I bet I could create a job for myself if I started a group and got people excited about gun rights and got them to give me some money. I could make myself a position. I could make myself a job. And then maybe down the road, I could parlay that into running for political office or a better job, right? So political entrepreneurs may be driven by something really utilitarian, like wanting money, wanting a job, wanting resume fodder, or they may be motivated by something deeply emotional, some emotional connection to a policy. But in either event, a political entrepreneur has a heightened interest beyond what most people experience. They are more interested in this outcome or in this endeavor than the typical human. And as a result, they have an incentive to spend the extra time and money to create a group. So now you've actually created the group. You've got this political entrepreneur who has, bought a domain name and set up a Facebook page and created a Twitter account. And now they want to get people, right? Now they want members. The way that interest groups get members is through the provision of something called selective benefits. The policy objective of an interest group is a public benefit. It's something that everyone will enjoy if the group is successful. Selective benefits are benefits that only go to members, right? So they could be material benefits. You could get some stuff, right? You could get, for example, AAA, the American Automobile Association. A lot of people don't realize this. They are an interest group, right? In fact, they're a very successful interest group. They lobby Congress about spending money on roads and and highway safety and a bunch of issues related to motorists, right? They actually have a very complex political agenda. Most people who join AAA don't even know what that agenda is. And they don't care. They join AAA because they get free roadside towing and discounts on hotels, right? They get material benefits. They get stuff. They get swag, right? And so those material benefits you only get if you join. If AAA is successful in their policy agenda, then we all benefit, but only members of AAA who pay the money to the organization get those discounts. Some benefits, selective benefits, are not material. Some are what we call purposive benefits or social benefits. These are related ideas. A purposive benefit is just feeling special, right? So for example, when you join the World Wildlife Federation, they send you a cute little sticker of a panda bear. Now, technically, that's a thing, right? So that's sort of material. It's not really worth anything, right? It's not like cash and prizes, right? It's just a stupid little sticker. But you put it on your car, and then everybody knows that you love the environment and that you care about the pandas and you care about the polar bears, and you feel good about yourself. So you get this sort of sense of belonging. In addition, a lot of groups, when you join, you get access to events that they host. You end up on a mailing list. You join a Facebook group. You join a group me, whatever it is. and you get access to people who are like-minded. So you meet people, you can make friends, you can meet your future spouse, who knows? But you meet people who share your interests, and you have the opportunity to do fun things with those people. So there's a social component. Some benefits are what we call informational benefits. I think the best example of informational benefits in the sort of modern era is the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. If you have a parent or a grandparent who is on Medicare, right, which is the public insurance program for the elderly, Medicare is super complicated, right? When you join Medicare, you have all of these Part D plans that cover prescription drugs, but some plans cover this drug and others cover that drug. And which one should you pick? You don't know. It's so confusing. Gone through this with both my mother and my grandmother, and I consider myself to be a reasonably bright person, and I was overwhelmed with the options. It's so confusing. If you join the AARP, which you can do when you turn 50, the AARP has this great plan where you can call them and you read them a list of the prescription medications that you take, and they will tell you which Part D plan is the best one for you, what's going to save you the most money. Oh my gosh, that is amazing. That is absolutely worth the cost of membership. So they provide this informational benefit, and you have to be a member of the AARP to use this resource. Okay, so the collective action problem, this concern with free riders and the fact that people have an incentive to stay home and let other people do the work, it's resolved by political entrepreneurs who have a heightened interest and are willing to kind of be the leaders of the groups. And then it's solved through the provision of selective benefits, some sort of benefit that you get only if you participate in the group and not just sort of wait for the policy outcomes. Okay, another big question that we face when we talk about interest groups is, what is the effect of interest groups on the democratic process? Remember, James Madison was very concerned about the threat of factions, the mischief of factions. Was he right to be worried? Do they really hurt our democratic process? It's unclear. Not surprisingly. Gosh, wouldn't it be great if there were an easy answer? But there isn't. One perspective on interest groups is that they're actually quite helpful. This is a theory called pluralism. And the idea behind pluralism and the role of interest groups is that if you look out at the landscape of people, right, just average citizens in the United States, there is this incredible diversity of perspectives. Take the issue of gun rights, right? There are people on both sides of that issue, but there are nuances, right? Some people are in favor of broader Second Amendment rights, but they don't want people with convictions for felonies to have guns. Some are in favor of, allowing anyone to own a gun, but not allowing certain types of guns on the market. There's this huge, complicated array of positions that people take. And most people, even if they care about those positions, they don't communicate those positions to their elected officials very effectively, right? You don't have time to call up your congressman and say, just for the record, here's where I stand on the issue of guns, right? You don't have time for that. So the idea in pluralism is that interest groups take all of that information that's out there, all of this sort of noise about different perspectives on an issue, and they organize it. And you can see look, the NRA and the Brady campaign for handgun violence, I forget what they're actually called, I'm sorry, the Brady campaign, which is the biggest gun control group. There are more people in the NRA than there are in the Brady campaign. Obviously, the pro-gun people win, right? Just numerically. And the NRA takes the interests and the issues and the concerns of all of their members, and they put it into a nice, neat document, and they hand it to members of Congress and say, here's what the people want, right? So interest groups act as a conduit of information between the electorate and our leaders. They help our leaders understand what it is that we want and see that in a more clear, refined way than they would if they just looked out at the mass of voters, right? So in other words, the pluralist perspective is that interest groups don't hurt democracy. They actually help democracy because they're just a reflection of what the voters want, right? There's a group for every position, and you can see how popular a particular position is by the size of the group. And you can understand exactly what the people who believe in X are thinking, why they believe in X, right? By looking at the rhetoric of the interest group. So interest groups actually clarify the political process. The two primary alternatives to pluralism, sort of other perspectives, are sometimes referred to as elitism and hyperpluralism. So the elitism perspective, or the elitist perspective, is that interest groups are problematic because they are very effective. They do convey the interests of certain subsections of the populace, but there is not a group for every perspective out there. Instead, the elitist perspective is that interest groups only represent elites. So people with money often have an interest group that represents their interests, and poor people typically do not. Sometimes we like to think that the analogy that I find helpful, and other people do as well, is that this is like music. And the pluralist perspective is that interest groups are like a symphony with lots of different musical instruments out there playing, but they sound great together. The elitist perspective is that it's like a symphony, but it's only woodwinds, right? Only a small group is actually playing, and all of the rest of the voices are silent. The hyperpluralist position is that, yeah, sure, every group is represented, but what interest groups do is make us look more polarized than we are. The pro-life and pro-choice interest groups tend to be extremely pro-life and extremely pro-choice. And most of the people in America are somewhere in the middle. And so if you just look at the interest groups, it looks like you've got people on these two ends of the spectrum, and no one in the middle, when in fact, in reality, most people are in the middle. So from a musical standpoint, the hyperpluralist perspective is that, yeah, it's a symphony, and every instrument is playing very loudly and a different song. So it's just noise. It just creates chaos. Again, I'm not sure that any one of these positions is exactly correct or incorrect. I think each of them has something to recommend it, right? So I think the pluralists make a good point. I think the elitists make a good point. The hyperpluralists also make a good point. So I think that probably the perspective that makes the most sense depends on the context, depends on particular moments in time, etc. But it's useful to think in those terms. Okay, we will pick up there later.